Good morning, and thanks for joining us, Collins Okeke. He's a human rights lawyer. A whole lot has been said about this, and on a daily basis, they say, well, we are being watched the world over, just the way everyone watches the other about rights issue. Now, let's talk about this. I remember the Vienna Declaration gave a whole lot of bite to what we have come to see as our rights today. What can you say that we have been able to do as a people now, that is bringing it back home? Have we been able to, well, stay off the negatives in terms of rights in the country?
Well, I would, if I were to respond to your questions, I would say that it's been a mixed bag. In certain areas, we've made progress. In other areas, we've been static. And in some other areas, we've actually regressed. So the areas we've done very well. We now have we now have a fundamental rights enforcement procedure rules, which for me is revolutionary and very progressive. So that is progress. You can see the National Human Rights Commission has become a bit more involved in human rights protection and enforcement. So that is progress. Now, the areas where we've been stagnant, you notice that the conditions of our prisons haven't improved. We don't have more prisons. We've really not dealt with issues of extrajudicial killings, and let me just sum it under right to dignity of human person. You notice that you see that the government treats citizens with contempt. You still see how people are run off the road and all that. So in that area, we're still where we are. Then the areas where we've regressed is the area of, say, death penalty, for example. We had thought that we had made progress in that area. We now have an official moratorium. But you notice now that with what happened in Edo State, and with the number of states that are beginning to impose the death penalty for certain crimes, you discover that it looks as if we're going backwards in that area. So we've made progress in certain areas. We've been static in some areas, and in certain areas we've actually gone backwards. Like, in fact, the one that I feel very, very, for me, I take very personal is the issue of a right to protest, for example. It looks as if, for the past, since the fuel subsidy protest, it's as if it's now unlawful to hold protests in Nigeria. So these are areas where we've basically gone backwards as a country.
I like the way you put it. You said seems. It doesn't mean that that is what it is.
Yeah, well, it's not as if it's, because when I say we've gone backwards, I'm not saying that they've made legislations that has taken us backwards, but government actions, the actions or the response of the state to these rights show that it looks as if we're going backwards. Because I don't know if you've been, apart from the protest that I think the APC held somewhere in Abuja, it's almost very difficult to hold any protest, even when the protests are in the interest of government. Like the one there was one that I think I saw on channels, the one that was put together by the Stop Impunity campaign, that they were just trying to mobilize to advocate for things that is supposed to help government, transparency, good governance, and they were tear gassed.
Okay, let's take it from the prisons, because we actually did a special on that. Some would wonder what form of rights do inmates have when you talk about violations of their rights. Well,
for a start, they should have a decent environment. They should be treated humanely. There are a couple of rules that be drawn out as to how they should prison really. They should the kind of the kind of relationship that should exist between the prison warders and the prisons. They should have access to good healthcare facilities, for example. They shouldn't be cramped up and all that. But because we've not, government has not been expanding in terms of building new prisons, you'll notice that it looks as if things are actually getting worse, because we still have about 80% of the inmates in prison on awaiting trial. So for me, I think that is that falls under the category of the areas where we've been static.
So that's another violation?
Yes, it is. The fact that
trials.
somebody is in prison doesn't mean that he doesn't have rights. There's certain basic minimum entitlements that he should get. You know.
Some people say that our constitution, you know, the very first chapter of our constitution talks about what we should expect from our country and what our country can do for us, so to speak. And they say that it's not justiciable, so they're trying to make sure that you can actually hold the Nigerian government responsible if it fails in those responsibility, you know, to provide the very basic things that could secure a human being, a citizen of that particular country. Do you think that that is one area we should be looking at? Because what it seems we're looking at right now are, let's say, peculiarities, not just one that sustains the average human life. For instance, right to shelter, right to marriage, right to life, so to speak, right to free speech. Those are the very basic that any human being should be able to expect from government, not to now start going into protest. How do you think that the government has been able to uphold those ones?
Well, what you're talking about basically is socio-economic rights. You know, the rights to shelter, food, you know, housing and all that, the right to adequate medical care and all that. The funny thing is that in most countries, they've actually moved away from civil and political rights, like the right to freedom of expression, right to personal liberty. And they move further than that. Now they are talking about these socio-economic rights. For example, in Nigeria, we're still grappling with the civil and political ones. We're still talking about freedom of expression, for example. I talked about the right to protest, which is a form of expression. So we've not even gone to that, reached that level yet.
The question is, which should come first?
Well, they are both important, because you can't talk about the right to life when people don't have food. For example, you can't talk about the right to life when there is no shelter, because they are all, in fact, a lot of the rights are actually interwoven. So they are all, you basically can't talk about one right without also looking at the other. So they are interdependent. So you can't talk about, for example, the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion without talking about access to education, for example, because you can't say I can express myself when I don't have education. So you can't talk about dignity of human person without shelter. You know, so they are all interwoven. So you really can't divorce them. But the tragedy of our situation is that we're still at the basics. You know, we're still dealing with issues of freedom of movement. We're still discussing state governments moving citizens from one state to another. So which are things that people should take for granted. So for me, I think we're still at the basics. We've not gotten to the level of, you know, now extending it to those socio-economic rights.
So you think that we should actually sort out the political rights first, so to speak, before we can actually move to those basic rights? Well,
I think that the political rights will find expression in the enforcement of socio-economic rights. So they are all. That's why I said it's difficult to separate them and say this one is maybe this one is different, and let's start with this one and then go to the next one. They're all interwoven.
But the question will be the institutions that are supposed to enforce this right. Now, do those operating these institutions, do they even understand the rights they are meant to enforce?
I think I honestly don't think they do. I honestly don't think they do, because sometimes when I hear government people mouth some of these international programs and policies, like the MGG, for example, sometimes they don't seem to understand that this has to do with rights. It is not a dividend, like what they say is not like a dividend of democracy, where you just you are helping the people. It's actually a right. So when we talk about halving poverty, you know, by 2015 or something, it's about rights, empowering people, you know, allowing people have access to basic needs.